Every Saturday morning, Beulah Crane sat in the same chair at the far end of the church hall table, the one closest to the window where the light came in, crooked and warm, and fell across whatever she happened to be doing with her hands. She had not chosen that chair on purpose the first time. She had simply arrived early, before the other women, and sat where there was space. But the following Saturday she had come in and found a man she did not recognize sitting there, and something in her chest had tightened in a way she could not entirely explain. He had moved when he saw her face. She had thanked him and sat down, and after that the chair was hers. Nobody said so. Nobody needed to. Beulah Crane had come to Harwick, Nebraska in the spring of 1887 with a single trunk, $31 in a cloth envelope sewn into the lining of her coat, and a letter of introduction to a man named Mr. Aldous Pruett, who ran the grain cooperative on the south side of town. The letter had been written by her mother's pastor back in Ohio, a kind man who had done what he could for a young woman with nowhere particular to go. Her mother had died in February. There had been no father in the picture for many years. There was a brother in Pennsylvania, but he had a wife and 4 children and a house already too small, and when Beulah had visited after the funeral she had understood, without anything being said unkindly, that there was no room for her there. Not really. She was 24 years old. She knew how to keep accounts, how to put up preserves, how to manage a household on very little. She was not afraid of hard work, and she was not sentimental about her circumstances. She had cried on the train west, and then she had stopped crying because there was nothing more to be done about it. Mr. Pruett had been expecting her. He was a round-faced man, in his 50s with ink on his fingers, and a manner that was brisk but not unkind. He told her that his wife had recently hired a girl to help with the house, and so could not take her on, but that he knew of a position. Not in town exactly, but close enough. A man named Doyle Hatch ran a cattle operation about 4 miles out. His housekeeper had left to marry in the fall, and he hadn't replaced her yet, and from what Mr. Pruett understood, the house was suffering for it. "He's a fair man," Mr. Pruett said. "Quiet, won't give you any trouble." Beulah had asked if there was anything else she ought to know. Mr. Pruett had thought about it. "He lost his boy 2 winters back," he said finally. "Fever. The boy was 7. Hatch hasn't been much for company since, but that's his own affair. He won't make it yours." She had taken the position. The drive out to the Hatch property was 4 miles of flat Nebraska sky, and the smell of turned earth, and something blooming she couldn't name. The man who drove her, a hired hand from the cooperative named Ellis, who talked steadily for all 4 miles, without seeming to require a response, pointed out the property when it came into view. A 2-story frame house, white once, but now the color of old cream, with a barn painted red behind it, and a windmill turning slowly in the March air. Doyle Hatch was not there when they arrived. Ellis carried her trunk inside, told her the kitchen was through the door on the left, and drove away. She stood in the front room and looked around. It was not dirty, exactly. It was the kind of room that had been clean once, and was now somewhere past the point where a man alone would notice the difference. There were dishes on the shelf, but not enough of them. There were curtains in the windows, but one had come partly off its rod and hung at an angle. There was a coat on a hook and boots by the door, and a hat on the table, and the hat had been there long enough to leave a faint ring in the wood. She took off her own coat and hung it on the hook beside his. She found the kitchen. She found the larder, which was better stocked than she'd expected but disorganized, in the way of a man who bought things without a plan. She found a bucket and a mop and a rag, and she started with the kitchen table, because you had to start somewhere, and that was where she was, on her knees scrubbing the baseboard, when the back door opened and Doyle Hatch came in. He stopped when he saw her. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was taller than she'd expected, with the kind of face that had been outdoors so long it had forgotten how to be any other color. Dark eyes, quiet, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. He was maybe 35, maybe 40. It was hard to tell with men who worked land for a living. "Miss Crane," he said. Not a question. Mr. Pruitt must have told him. "Mr. Hatch," she said. He looked at the bucket. He looked at the baseboard. He looked at her. "I'll have a room ready for you by tonight," he said. "Top of the stairs. Last door there's a lock." "Thank you," she said. He hung his hat, not on the table, and went back outside. That was how they met. The room was small and clean, and had a window that looked out over the back field, and there was a quilt on the bed that had been put there recently enough that she could still smell the cedar from wherever it had been stored. She did not know if he had put it there, or if it had simply always been in that room waiting. She did not ask. She settled into the work of the house the way she settled into most things, methodically, without fuss. The kitchen first, then the larder, then the front room, the curtain back on its rod, the dishes sorted, and the ones that were cracked set aside. She found a calendar on the wall, still showing October of the previous year, and she replaced it with a current one from a drawer where several had been stored, apparently unopened. Doyle, Hatch, went out early and came in late. He ate what she put on the table, without complaint and without much comment, beyond a word or two of acknowledgement. He was not rude. He simply did not seem to know, quite, how to be in a house with another person anymore. And she understood that this was a thing that had been learned, and could perhaps be relearned given time. She did not push. She learned his habits, the way you learn the habits of any unfamiliar place, by observation, by small adjustments, by trial. He took his coffee black and very hot. He preferred salt pork to bacon when she could get it. He came in at noon for exactly 20 minutes and ate whatever was set out, and went back to work without sitting down. He did not like the sound of music, but he also did not say so. She simply noticed that he went still and distant when the woman 2 farms over played her organ on warm evenings when the windows were open, and she filed the information away. There was a photograph on the mantel, a boy, maybe 6 or 7, with his father's dark eyes and a gap where a front tooth had been. She did not ask about it. She dusted the frame and put it back exactly where it had been. The church was in town, 4 miles back the way she'd come, and on Sundays there was a wagon from one of the neighboring farms that passed the Hatch property and had room for one more. The woman who drove it was named Mrs. Boone, a solid, cheerful woman in her 50s who knew everything about everyone in a 10-mile radius and shared it freely. "Hatch doesn't come to service anymore," Mrs. Boone told her the first Sunday without being asked. "Not since the boy. Can't say I blame him, though Reverend Aldgate has tried. Some losses turn a man's face away from things." Beulah said she understood. "You'll sit with us," Mrs. Boone said. It was not a question. The church was small and white-painted and smelled of lemon oil and wool coats. Beulah sat with Mrs. Boone and her daughter and listened to Reverend Aldgate, who was a thin, precise man with a voice that rang better than his appearance suggested it would. She did not know anyone. Several people looked at her in the way of a small community, examining a newcomer, and she met their eyes calmly and did not look away first. She found the chair by the window at the hall table afterward, when the women were setting out the food for the shared meal, and she sat in it because it was there. The light came through and warmed her hands, and she thought, briefly, of her mother's kitchen in Ohio, the way the morning sun came in at the same angle, and then she put the thought somewhere manageable and concentrated on the biscuits. Someone was passing. She went back the next Sunday, and the next. The chair was always there, and she always sat in it. And after a few weeks, it was simply understood. It was in early May that she first noticed the man looking at her. He was across the hall table, 3 seats down, and she would not have noticed him at all, except that when she glanced up to take the butter dish, being passed her way, he was already looking, and did not look away immediately, the way a person usually does when caught. He just held her gaze for a moment, not boldly, not rudely, just steadily, and then he looked down at his plate. She looked down at hers. He was perhaps a few years older than her, with a face she did not know, not from the immediate area, she thought, or not someone she'd been introduced to. He was neatly dressed in the way of a man who is careful about such things, and there was something about the way he sat, slightly apart from the easy conversation around him, that made her think of someone recently arrived somewhere new. She did not ask Mrs. Boone about him immediately. She had learned to be selective about which threads to pull with Mrs. Boone. But the following Sunday he was there again, and he sat in almost the same place, and he did not look at her the same way. He was careful about it this time, more ordinary in his attention. But she was aware of him in the room, in the way you become aware of something that has been placed slightly askew. The third Sunday she came in, and he was already at the table, and he looked up and nodded at her. The way you nod at someone you have begun to recognize, and she nodded back. His name she eventually learned from Mrs. Boone, who offered it without being asked, which told Beulah that Mrs. Boone had been watching more carefully than she let on, was Marsh Calloway. He had come from Missouri the previous fall to work on the Finch property east of town. He was good with horses, according to Mrs. Boone, which in Nebraska was as strong a character reference as most things. He's quiet, Miss Boone added, with a meaningful look that Beulah declined to acknowledge. Doyle Hatch asked about the church, eventually. She had not expected him to. It was a Tuesday evening in late May, and she was mending a tear in the tablecloth, and he was at the other end of the table going over the books in the way he did some evenings, not talking, the two of them occupying the same silence, without discomfort. "The service," he said, without looking up from the ledger. "Is it a good one?" It was not quite a question. "Reverend Aldgate is clear-headed," she said. "He doesn't run long. The congregation is neighborly." Doyle was quiet for a moment. His pen moved. "My wife used to say Aldgate was the best preacher within 50 miles, he said. Said his sermons had bones." She had not known there was a wife. She had assumed, without quite thinking about it, that there had been. She said, "That's a good way to put it." He did not say anything more about it. She did not ask. But the following Sunday, when Mrs. Boone's wagon slowed at the end of the drive, the front door of the house opened, and Doyle Hatch came out in his good coat with his hat in his hand. Mrs. Boone looked at Beulah. Beulah looked at the road. He climbed up without ceremony and nodded at Mrs. Boone and rode the 4 miles in silence, and Beulah sat beside him and watched the fields go by and did not make any more of it than it was. The congregation noticed. She could tell by the way heads turned, briefly and then politely away, when the two of them came in together. Not unkindly, just with the attention a small community gives to things that represent change. Doyle chose a pew toward the back. She sat beside him because it would have been stranger not to. He held his hat on his knee and looked at Reverend Aldgate. And she was aware, in the peripheral and not quite conscious way of these things, that his shoulders had dropped slightly when the first hymn began, not in grief, or not only in grief, but in something that might have been the beginning of relief. At the shared meal afterward, they parted naturally. She went to her chair by the window. He stood near the door with 2 men from the north side of the valley and talked about weather and water rights, the way men did. Marsh Calloway was at his usual place down the table. He looked at her chair. He looked at her. He said, "Miss Crane," in the quiet way he had of speaking, and she said, "Good morning, Mr. Calloway," and that was the whole of it, and somehow it was the most words they had exchanged directly, and she thought about it later in the wagon on the way home and could not entirely account for why. June came in hot and dry. Marsh Calloway had a habit, she had noticed, of arriving early to set up the tables for the shared meal, something the younger unattached men did as a kind of unofficial contribution to the community work. He was good at it, efficient without drawing attention to himself, and she had watched him without meaning to, the way you watch someone who moves in a room the way you expect them to. He began to stop at her end of the table, not to sit. He rarely sat in the same place twice, but to set the dishes nearest to her chair, to make sure there was a serving spoon where there hadn't been one, small functional things that could be attributed to nothing at all. She took note of these things the way she had learned to take note of most things, quietly, without conclusion. Mrs. Boone had begun to watch them both with the expression of a woman with an opinion she was exercising great restraint in not sharing. Beulah found this more amusing than she let show. Doyle Hatch, for his part, came to service most Sundays now. He spoke more than he had. Not much more, but enough that she had begun to understand the shape of him. A man who chose words deliberately, who found talk for its own sake wasteful, but who was not without humor and not without warmth. It was simply buried under a great weight of loss and work and weather, and the particular loneliness of a man who had stopped expecting his life to surprise him. One evening in late June, a storm rolled in from the northwest with the kind of speed that always startled her, the sky going green-gray in the time it took to bring the laundry in, and she was just shutting the last window when the back door came open and Doyle came in wet to the skin, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the dry room and the lamp burning on the table and the pot still warm on the stove, and something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. He said, "Thank you, Miss Crane." She said, "Hang your coat by the fire." He did. It was a Sunday in late July when Marsh Calloway finally asked her to walk. The shared meal had run long because of a birthday celebration for one of the older deacons, and there were still people in the hall, plates being cleared, children being rounded up. She had stepped outside for the air because the room had grown warm, and she was standing on the step looking at the street when she heard the door, and he came and stood beside her. "It's cooler out here," he said. "It is," she said. A pause. The sound of someone inside laughing. "Miss Crane," he said, "I wonder if you might walk with me, down to the end of the block and back." She considered it. He was a decent man, she believed. He had been nothing but respectful. The block was visible from the church door. "All right, Mr. Calloway," she said. They walked. He told her about Missouri, about the farm where he'd grown up, the kind of farming done in river country, how different it was from what he did now. She told him about Ohio. He asked good questions and listened to the answers, and did not talk about himself more than was natural. By the time they reached the end of the block and turned back, she had the impression of a man who had been thinking about this walk for longer than it took to arrange it. "I'd like to walk with you again if you'd allow it," he said at the church door. "I expect that would be all right," she said. She went back inside and helped clear the remaining dishes, and did not look to see if he was watching. She did not tell Doyle about the walks. It was not something she was obligated to tell him. He was her employer, not her family, and the arrangement between them was clear and professional, and whatever additional warmth had grown in the space of shared meals and shared storms was simply neighborly. That was all she called it when she thought about it, but she noticed in August that he had begun to wait for the wagon in the morning rather than letting her go ahead. Not conspicuously. He simply found a reason to be near the house when Mrs. Boone's wagon came, and he climbed in after her, and the rides to church were quiet and companionable, and she was aware that this had become a habit, the same way the chair had become a habit, the same way the early morning coffee had become a habit, simply because no one had disrupted it, and so it continued. She noticed that he noticed Marsh Calloway. She knew this because Doyle noticed everything, quietly, without comment, and what he noticed about Marsh Calloway was the way Marsh Calloway's attention organized itself in the hall, the direction it bent without being obvious about bending. He said nothing. He sat in his pew, and came to the meal and stood with the ranchers and talked about cattle prices. And he said nothing. But one afternoon in late August, he came in at midday, and instead of eating and going back out, he stood in the kitchen doorway with the afternoon behind him and said, "Are you content here, Miss Crane?" She looked at him. It was not the kind of question he asked. He was not a man who asked about contentment. He was a man who asked if the north pasture fence needed mending and whether she needed anything from town. "I am," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He had never learned. She had come to understand how to look directly at a thing he cared about. "I want you to know," he said, "that this house is better for having you in it." Then he put his hat on and went back out. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down in her chair at the kitchen table, the one near the window where the afternoon light came in. And she thought about what a man who said very little meant when he said the particular things he said. September brought a spell of warm weather that felt borrowed. Everyone knew it wouldn't hold. The Sunday meals moved back outside under the elms, long tables with oilcloth, children running in the dry grass. Marsh Calloway walked with her again. And the Sunday after, he was pleasant company. He made her laugh twice, which was not a thing she did easily or often, and she liked him for it. She liked him altogether. She thought, he was a good man, steady and considerate and interested in her in a way that was clear without being presumptuous. She simply was not sure that liking was the thing she was looking for. She had sat with this uncertainty for several weeks when Mrs. Boone, in the direct way she sometimes abandoned her usual delicacy for, said, while they were rolling biscuit dough side by side in the church kitchen, "He's going to ask you something soon, I think." Beulah said, "Is he? You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." Mrs. Boone looked at her sideways. "Are you pleased about it?" Beulah was quiet for a moment, working the dough. "I'm thinking about it," she said, which was honest, and seemed to satisfy Mrs. Boone, who let it alone. What happened was this. The last Sunday of September, the weather finally broke. The air came down from the north, cold and clean, the kind of air that smelled of everything ending, and people went into service with their coats buttoned. Beulah came in with Mrs. Boone and went to sit in her usual place in the pew. And she looked across the aisle, and Doyle Hatch was already there, one row ahead. And he glanced back when she sat down, just a glance, the reflex of a man who has learned where someone usually enters, and she met it, and he turned back to face the front. Reverend Aldgate preached on faithfulness, on the particular endurance required to tend things that grow slowly. She listened, and her hands were folded in her lap, and she was aware, in the way she was always aware of things she had not decided yet, of the two men in her vicinity and the very different quality of her awareness of each of them. After the service, she went to her chair. She set the butter out and the bread, and she waited for whatever Sunday would bring. Marsh Calloway came and sat near her, and they talked, and it was easy and warm and good, and she liked it. He was telling her about a horse he'd gentled that week. A story with a quiet, satisfying shape to it. And she was listening, and genuinely glad to be listening. And then she looked up for some reason she couldn't name. A sound, a shift in the light. And Doyle Hatch was standing across the room, watching her. Not watching her the way he watched fence lines or cloud banks, or the things that needed attending. Watching her the way a man watches something he has. Finally, at great cost, allowed himself to see she looked at him. He looked away. She turned back to Marsh Calloway and said something. She didn't know what, and he answered, and the conversation went on. But something had shifted in her chest, and she couldn't locate what it was, or put it back. That night she heard him in the barn later than usual, and she sat at the kitchen table with her mending, and the lamp turned low. And she thought with more honesty than she usually permitted herself about what she actually wanted from the life she was building in this place. She wanted the chair by the window, she wanted the work she was good at, and the satisfaction of a house that was orderly and warm. She wanted it Sunday mornings with Mrs. Boone on the wagon, and Reverend Aldgate's clear-boned sermons, and the smell of the food in the hall. She wanted the person who came home to that house. She had known it for a while. She had been careful with the knowledge, turning it over privately, making sure it was true and not just something that felt true because she was lonely. Loneliness could make almost anything look like what you needed. She had learned that from watching other people, and she had been careful, and she had waited, and she still believed what she believed. She was still sitting there when he came in. He saw the light. He stopped in the doorway. "You're still up," he said. "I am," she said. He came in and hung his hat and stood at the counter with his back to her, and she could see the effort of a man who had something to say and had no practice in saying it. She waited. He turned around. "Miss Crane," he said, "I've been a poor hand at." He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not easy to live alongside. I know that. I've known it a while, and I've had reasons to let it be so, but..." Another stop. His hands were open at his sides. A posture she recognized as being as close as he came to helplessness. She set down her mending. "Mr. Hatch," she said. He looked at her. "I know what kind of man you are," she said. "I've had 6 months to observe it." He said nothing. "And I know what kind of house this is," she said. "Not because of the curtains or the larder. Because of who keeps it." A long quiet. "I'm not asking you to be easy," she said. "I wouldn't know what to do with easy." Something happened in his face, not a dramatic thing. Doyle Hatch was not a man for dramatic things. But the set of his jaw changed, the particular tight control of it releasing slightly, and he looked at her as though he had taken a step and found ground where he had expected air. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as." He gestured, a small frustrated motion. "I mean to say, permanently." And she looked at the lamp. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "All right." The town knew by the following Sunday, because small towns know these things before anyone says them aloud. There were looks and nods, and 2 women found reasons to speak to Beulah at the shared meal, with warmth in their faces that hadn't been absent before, but was now more deliberate, more weighted. Mrs. Boone pressed her hand and said nothing, which was the most eloquent thing Beulah had seen her do. Marsh Calloway found her by the window table and said, simply, "Congratulations, Miss Cranes," with a steadiness that she respected and was grateful for, and she said, "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." And that was that, and he was a good man, she thought again, and she hoped the world would be fair to him. Doyle did not stand with her at the meal. That was not his way, and it would have been strange and conspicuous, and she would not have wanted it. He was across the room with the ranchers, same as always, talking about the coming winter, the price of feed. But when Mrs. Boone's wagon was ready to leave, and Beulah went out and climbed up, he was already there. He had beaten her to it, for once. He was sitting on the bench with his hat on, and his hands on his knees, and when she settled beside him, he glanced over, and she could see the edge of something in his face that had not been there before. Not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but ease. The ease of a man who has set something down he has been carrying for a long time. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the road ahead. The wind was cold, and the sky was enormous, and the fields on either side of the track had gone the color of old gold, and the wheels turned on the hard dirt, and 4 miles had never felt like quite enough.